Widowed rancher needed a wife to keep his land, but the only one left was the cook girl with property burned into her arm. Coldwater, Wyoming. Winter of 1876. Snow blanketed the prairie like a funeral shroud. The wind moaned through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the distant howl of a wolf. The moon hung pale over the Ward ranch, its light tracing silver over the frost-glazed roof of the barn. Horses shifted in their stalls, hooves stamping against cold earth. Inside the kitchen, the fire snapped weakly, casting long shadows against worn walls that had seen too much silence. Gideon Ward stood stiffly by the table. The envelope from the Coldwater Bank opened and spread, like a death sentence in his hand. He stared at the words again, already memorized, before folding the letter with the same tension one might fold a flag over a coffin. His shoulders were broad but burdened, his jaw set as if clenched against more than just the cold. Clara stood at the stove, her back to him, stirring a pot of rabbit stew. The scent of thyme and bone broth filled the room. Her long, dark braids swung behind her as she moved. She did not look at him. Her sleeves were rolled just enough to reveal strength in her arms, but never high enough to show what lay above her. Elbow, he cleared his throat. Bank says I need a wife to keep this land. You're the only one left here, Clara. She did not turn, only paused the stirring for a breath, then continued. I'm your cook, not your bride, Mr. Ward. Find someone else. The clock on the wall ticked 2, loudly. Gideon stepped closer, stopping by the hearth. His voice softened, but not enough to hide the desperation beneath. There ain't anyone else. Not here. Not with snow coming and no roads open till spring. I've got 30 days. After that, they take the deed. Now she turned. Her eyes, black as wet stone, met his with neither fear nor warmth, only caution. Her cheekbones were sharp beneath her sun-dark skin, her lips set in a line carved by years without safety. Why me? Because you're already here and because I trust you with my boy. A long silence. The stew bubbled outside, a gust of wind rattled the window panes. Clara finally ladled soup into a bowl and set it on the table. Then she walked past him, her boots heavy on the floorboards, and opened the back door. The cold blasted in. She stepped outside into the snow, knee-deep, and knelt beside a pile of wood, tying it with a thin strip of worn leather. Gideon followed to the doorway, but didn't. Speak! She returned moments later, arms full of kindling, eyes unreadable. I don't take charity, she said, brushing past him. He nodded, not arguing. Instead, he reached behind the rocker by the hearth-hand, pulled out a folded bundle. It was an old wool coat, navy blue, lined with lamb's wool, buttons tarnished. He laid it over the back of her chair. For the cold. Clara looked at it, not touching it. I've got my own, she said, but didn't move it away. From outside, faint voices carried through the wind. Laughter, then a muttered slur. Words marrying a Comanche now. They both heard it. Clara did not flinch, but her eyes flicked to the window. Her voice, when she spoke again, was steady. They'll burn your barn for that. I'll build another, he replied. She sat slowly. The fire cracked. Behind them, Gideon took a plate of cornbread from the table and placed it gently beside her bowl. She looked at it for a long while. Then, without a word, tore a piece, dipped it in the broth, and ate. He sat across from her, elbows on the table. Their eyes met across the firelight. Clara swallowed, then whispered almost to herself, I'll think about it. Gideon nodded once solemnly. That's enough for now. Outside, snow fell harder. The fire warmed the walls, and for a moment in that kitchen on the edge of nowhere, there was no war, no scars, no laws written to divide, only 2 survivors waiting to see if they could build something out of ash. Days. Later, the wind had calmed, but the cold remained. Snow crunched beneath boots, and the sun skimmed low across the horizon, casting long shadows from the broken fence posts behind the Ward barn. Inside the kitchen, Clara moved silently, ladling porridge into a tin bowl, her braid tucked under a shawl. Amos giggled as he chased a moth near the fire, his small footsteps echoing off the wooden floor. Gideon had left early, or so Clara thought. She preferred it that way. Since his strange proposal, she had done her best to avoid lingering glances or too much quiet in the same room. She had not said yes. She had not said no, but she had stayed, and that was enough for now. Outside, she tied her shawl tighter and carried her tools to the fence line. Several rails had collapsed under the weight of the last snowstorm. She dropped to one knee and began the work. With practiced hands, she cut strips of rawhide and used a crisscross knot her grandfather had taught her before he was taken. Comanche knots were meant to last through storms and men. From the stable, Gideon watched her, the way she moved, quiet and efficient. She didn't waste strength. She didn't ask for help. Something about that made him ache and admire her all at once. He slung a bucket of water over his shoulder and crossed the snow to the horses. "They need you too," he said without looking at her. Clara didn't reply. She pulled the final strip tight and moved to the next post, but her eyes flicked toward him once, then away. Behind the barn, hoofbeats crunched. A man in a dark coat on a chestnut gelding slowed near the fence. His face was narrow, beard trimmed, too clean for a rancher, a bounty hunter, or worse, an enforcer. He didn't speak, just looped his reins over the post and drew a small knife. He dragged it slowly across the top rail, leaving a shallow, deliberate groove. Gideon stepped between him and Clara. "You lost?" The man smiled thinly. "Just admiring your property, Ward. Looks like the kind that won't be yours much longer. Nothing for sale here." The man tipped his hat and rode off. The groove remained. Clara stared at it, expression unreadable. That night, after Amos was tucked into bed, Clara returned from the barn with arms full of wood. Her fingers were red, raw from the cold. She said nothing as she lit the fire. Gideon sat across the room whittling a piece of pine. When she placed a pot of soup on the table, he stood, walked out without a word, and returned minutes later carrying a hammer and a chisel. In the glow of lantern light, he approached the old barn door. On the highest plank just above the latch, he carved a small five-pointed star. Steady, slow strokes into the grain. Clara watched. From the kitchen window, when he finished, he stepped back, nodding once. "So you don't lose your way," he said quietly. The next morning, Clara rose before dawn. She boiled soup and left a bowl on the table. A folded napkin beside it read in careful, "Letters for your boy." By afternoon, the wind had turned. Gideon returned from town, shoulders stiff, jaw tight. The banker had sent another letter, this one curt and final. But inside the barn, he paused. There, by the saddle rack, hung his wife's old coat. It was no longer folded, but hung carefully on a peg, the sleeves brushed clean, the collar repaired. Clara stood beside it, trying it on. The navy wool draped over her shoulders like it belonged there. She turned to see him watching. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. She did not look away this time. There was no warmth in her gaze. Not yet, but there was no coldness either. Only something careful, something considering. He nodded once. She did not smile, but she did not frown. Her posture straightened, the coat hugging her like armor. She stepped past him slowly, boots sure on the wooden floor. And for the first time in weeks, the barn did not feel quite so empty. The sun had barely risen when Clara noticed the barn door ajar, and the stillness too deep. The usual morning clatter of Amos's feet never came. She called his name once, twice, no answer. The wooden spoon slipped from her fingers and hit the floor. Outside, tracks in the snow led away from the porch, small, hurried, and alone. Clara grabbed her shawl, tied a hunting knife beneath it, and ran. The woods were dense just past the ravine, where tangled pines stood tall and silent. Her breath came in clouds, branches snapped beneath her boots, then faintly a cry. "Mama!" It was Amos. Clara sprinted. She found him cornered beneath a thicket, eyes wide with terror. A thin trail of blood ran from his ankle where he had tripped. Surrounding him, 3 wolves low to the ground, teeth bared, one already circling, without. Hesitating, Clara whistled, a sharp rising note, and threw a handful of snow at the nearest animal. They froze, startled. She stepped between Amos and the wolves, blade drawn, stance low. "Back!" she barked in Comanche. The wolves hesitated. One lunged. She slashed the air sharp and sure, catching its muzzle just enough to startle. With a guttural cry, she grabbed a burning branch from a fallen tree nearby and waved it wildly. The fire hissed. The wolves scattered into the brush, growling as they vanished into the woods. She knelt, heart pounding. "You're safe now," she whispered, wrapping Amos in her shawl. Blood soaked through his sock, but he was breathing. His small hands clung to her tightly, face buried against her. Gideon arrived moments later, rifle in hand, eyes wild. Amos. Clara. Stood, holding the boy. "I found him." Gideon ran forward, taking the boy into his arms. He froze when he saw Clara's torn sleeve. The frayed fabric had pulled back, revealing a raw, discolored scar burned deep into the skin of her upper arm. A word. Treasury paper. The letters were crooked, as if seared by a hand. Untrained, but intentional, ugly, permanent. "Ah," his voice cracked. "Who did that to you?" Clara pulled her shawl back up slowly. Her eyes met his, not angry, not ashamed. "I survived," she said simply. He didn't speak, didn't move, just looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. That night, whispers circled through town. A ranch hand claimed Clara had fought off a pack of wolves with nothing but a knife and fire. Someone else claimed she carried scars from her time as a Comanche captive. Someone else said she had magic. "She's dangerous," they murmured. "She's not natural. She was property once. She could turn on him." Back at the ranch, Clara sat quietly by the fire, carving a small wooden charm. Her hands trembled only slightly. Her knife moved carefully, forming the delicate curves of a wolf's head. She hung it on the gatepost at the front of the property, just above where Amos's hand would reach. Gideon watched from the barn. Later that night, he walked into the kitchen, placed a folded handkerchief on the edge of her bedroll. "For your hands," he murmured. She looked at it, then at him, a pause, then she nodded barely. The next morning, he found the fence post near the boy's favorite path, marked with shallow carvings, spirals, and arrows, protective symbols from her people. Beneath, them. Her initials, small and steady. For Amos. That night, as the wind carried distant howls across the hills, Gideon stood beside her beneath the moon. She didn't move away when he came near. "You are more than a cook," he said, voice low. She didn't reply, but she turned her head slowly, and their eyes met, uncertain, unguarded for the first time. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. The papers were signed in silence. No church, no vows, no witnesses, but the wind scraping across the windows. Gideon and Clara sat opposite the county clerk in cold water, a man who did not look them in the eye as he stamped the seal. Afterward, they rode back in the wagon together. Amos slept curled under a blanket. In the back, unaware that his father had just taken a wife, or that the woman who stirred his soup every evening now carried his family name. Inside the kitchen that night, Clara moved with quiet grace. She stirred a pot of soup with one hand while showing Amos how to start a flame with flint and dried grass. He clapped with excitement when the first sparks caught. "You remember the 3 breaths," Clara said softly. "Not too fast. The fire needs to trust you." Gideon watched from the doorway, arms folded, leaning against the frame. A strange warmth filled his chest, something like pride, something like home. But peace was fleeting in cold water. The next day, just before dusk, smoke coiled into the sky behind the barn. Gideon ran first, rifle in hand. Clara followed with a bucket. Flames licked the hay pile stacked by the fence, small, but hungry. A broken lantern lay nearby. The same knife groove from days ago now had black scorch marks beside it. The fire was controlled quickly. Gideon smothering the base with his coat, Clara flinging water with practiced force. Their hands met once on the bucket handle, fingers brushing through steam and soot. Neither pulled away. When it was over, the barn stood, but just barely. Gideon cursed under his breath. "He said he'd do it," he growled. "Said he'd burn what he could not buy." Clara looked toward the town. "Will he come back?" Gideon nodded. "If the bank keeps pushing, yes." Clara wrapped her arms around herself. Later, in the quiet of the evening, Gideon laid a bundle beside her bedroll. It was a thin strip of fresh leather. She touched it gently. "You made this?" "Cut it from the last good saddle strap." She nodded once, a gesture of thanks not quite spoken aloud. The next morning, Gideon found a small plate on his workbench in the barn, still warm, covered by a cloth. Beneath it, a wedge of cornbread, buttered and golden. A note, scribbled in careful letters. "For your heart." That night, Clara stood near the hearth, her hands idle for once. "You want to know how I got the scar?" she said, voice low. Gideon turned from the window. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." She nodded slowly. "I was 13. My village was raided in the dark. They didn't ask questions, just took what they wanted. Horses, blankets, children. I was small, strong, easy to move. They sold me to a man near the Texas border. He branded me. After I ran once," she pulled back her sleeve just enough to reveal the raised, burned letters. "He called me girl, never by name. When he died, the others passed me around until I found a way to run for good." Her voice shook. "Some days I still smell the iron." Gideon crossed the room slowly. He reached for her hand. She flinched, then let him. "You're no one's property," he said firmly. "Not now. Not ever again." Her fingers tightened around his, and then, to his surprise, she began to cry. Quiet, fierce tears that ran without sound down her cheeks. He said nothing more, just stood with her as the firelight flickered and the storm outside gathered in the distance. Clara knelt beside the hearth, brushing a soft tune from her lips as she stirred. The stew. Amos sat cross-legged at her feet, mimicking the rhythm. His small voice carried the melody she had taught him, an old Comanche lullaby shaped by wind and memory. "Again?" he asked, beaming. She nodded. "One more time, but slower this time. Let the song breathe." Outside, Gideon hammered a new brace to the barn door. His sleeves were rolled, jaw set in quiet focus. Each blow of the hammer echoed like a heartbeat across the open yard. Behind him, the scar from the fire still blackened part of the fence, a reminder of how close they'd come. But his mind was elsewhere. He had received word that the bank was sending someone, an attorney, to verify the legitimacy of the marriage. It wasn't enough to have signed papers. They wanted proof, witness, conviction. Gideon stood by the workshop table that night, pen in hand. By lantern light, he began to write. "To whom it may concern, I, Gideon Ward, declare Clara Ward, not only my lawful wife, but the woman who holds this land together." The words were halting at first, then steadier. He wrote not for bureaucracy, but for truth, for himself, for her. unseen. By him, Clara stood at the edge of the doorway, watching. She said nothing, but her eyes lingered on the curve of his handwriting, the way his brow furrowed with care. Something shifted in her then, less like a falling and more like a soft, steady settling, like coming home. The next morning, she found the frame of the front, door sanded clean with fresh chisel marks just above the latch. Clara, etched in block letters. He passed by as she was tracing the carving with her fingers. "For my wife," he said simply, and walked on. She didn't follow, but later, while Amos napped, she took one of the leather cords he liked to play with, tied it into a small loop, and hung it gently around his neck. "For our boy," she whispered, brushing his hair back. When the lawyer arrived, he came not alone. The same bounty hunter rode behind him, arms crossed, lips curled in that half-smile Clara had come to dread. Gideon met them at the gate. The lawyer adjusted his gloves. "We'll need a few words, Mr. Ward, about your arrangement." Gideon didn't waver. "There's no arrangement. Clara is my wife." The man raised a brow. "Convenient timing." Gideon stepped aside, gesturing toward the porch. Clara emerged, holding Amos by the hand. Her braid hung long over her shoulder, and her gaze was steady. Gideon turned to her, then took her hand gently. "She's not here for land," he said, voice low, but firm. "She's here because she's the only part of this place that still feels like home." Clara looked at him, eyes wide, not in fear, but something close to awe. She squeezed his hand. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Is this what you want, ma'am?" Clara lifted her chin. "I chose this home. I chose him." There was silence. Then the lawyer nodded, scribbled a note in his ledger, and motioned for the rider to leave him behind. Later, as the sun dipped low, casting the ranch in copper light, Gideon stood beside Clara on the porch. Neither spoke, but the land felt quieter, less burdened, as if the wind had finally decided to leave them alone. The fire started just after sundown. Gideon smelled the smoke first, sharp and bitter, not like hearthwood. Then came Amos's cry from the kitchen. "Fire!" He ran for the door, rifle already in hand, heart pounding as he saw the south fence ablaze, flames dancing in a cruel line across the dry posts. Behind them, shadows moved fast and mounted, retreating toward the road. One rider lingered long. Enough to toss a match and sneer. Clara was faster than him. She tore past the porch, braid flying behind her, a pail of water in each hand. No fear, no hesitation. She dropped to her knees at the edge of the flames. Scooping snow and dirt in practiced movements, her voice rose in sharp commands, words in Comanche he had never heard. Not clearly. She moved like someone born in fire. Gideon joined her, slamming down buckets, tearing a blanket from the laundry line, and beating the flames. Behind them, neighbors arrived, some on horseback, some with shovels. Townsfolk who days ago would not meet Clara's eyes now stood shoulder to shoulder, stamping flames beneath heavy boots. Together, they fought the fire back. When it was done, Clara stood alone in the field, smoke curling around. Her dress was singed, her hands blackened with ash, but she stood tall, chest rising with slow, measured breath. Gideon walked to her side, blood still hot with fury. The bounty hunter stood at the edge of the fence, arms crossed, expression smug. "You'll lose more than fences if you keep hiding behind her." Gideon stepped forward, rifle raised, not aimed, not yet, but close. "You set one more flame on my land and you won't ride out again." The man spat, then turned his horse and rode hard into the night. When it was quiet again, the townsfolk lingered. One woman stepped forward, placing a bucket at Clara's feet. "You're braver than most of us," she said. Clara looked at her, unsure, but the woman nodded. "We see it now." That night, Clara sat near the hearth, mending Gideon's shirt. Her fingers moved. slowly over the worn fabric, patching it with soft blue cloth. She folded it neatly and placed it at the foot of his bedroll. "For your warmth," she wrote on a small slip of paper tucked inside the collar. Upstairs, on the small table beside her bed, Gideon had left a jar of wildflowers, dried, but still holding color. "For our home," the note read. Later, as the moon rose high, casting silver across the land, Clara stepped outside. She wore no shawl. The scar on her arm, burned and raised, was bare in the moonlight. The townsfolk had gathered by the fence, waiting. She stepped forward, heart pounding. "I was once a possession," she said, "branded like cattle, passed between men like coin." She paused. "But I survived. I am not property. I am not shame. I am a woman, and this land is my choice." A hush followed. Then, one by one, heads nodded. Someone clapped. Others followed. Gideon moved to her side. Wordless, he wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "You're not my possession," he whispered. "You're my home." She closed her eyes, resting her forehead against his shoulder. And under the moonlight, in front of strangers who now understood, they stood together. No longer cook and rancher, no longer runaway and widower, but something else entirely. Something whole. The snow melted slowly that year, retreating like a tired soldier. By early April, soft shoots of green broke through the hard-packed earth near the porch. Clara was the first to rise each morning, knees in the dirt, hands guiding seeds into the ground, carrots, onions, squash. She moved with quiet purpose, sleeves rolled, hair loose under the warming sun. Gideon watched her from the porch, hammer in hand. He was building a rocking chair from leftover oak, smoothing each edge as if shaping more than wood. By late afternoon, the frame was done. He placed it facing east, where the sun touched the fence line first. The seat creaked as he tested it. It held. Amos ran past them, both barefoot and shrieking with joy. "Ma, come see the lizard!" Clara looked up, brushing soil from her fingers. "What kind?" "A fast one." She smiled and followed. Gideon's eyes lingered on the way Amos grabbed her hand without thought, as if it had always belonged there. Later that week, townsfolk began arriving in twos and threes. A sack of flour, a spool of thread, a handmade shawl, stitched with red blossoms. "For the bride?" they said shyly, offering the gifts. Clara accepted them all with a nod and a small smile, her shoulders no longer tense, her gaze no longer guarded. The fence had burned, but the wall between her and the town had fallen too. The wedding came with no announcement, no priest. Just a circle of friends by the river behind the barn, the trees budding pale green. Clara wore a dress she had sewn herself, simple cotton tied with a leather sash. Gideon wore his best shirt, still patched where she had mended it months ago. Amos stood between them, holding both their hands. A friend from town read a blessing, and they exchanged words meant not for ceremony, but for truth. "I saw you," Gideon said, voice low. "Not when you came here, but when you stayed." Clara's voice didn't tremble. "You gave me a name I chose, not one I had to survive." They kissed soft and unhurried as the river sang behind them. That night, Clara placed a thin strip of braided leather over the back of the new porch chair. A small carving marked its center, 3 lines intertwined. "The Comanche symbol for family. For our family," the tag read. Gideon found it at dawn. He didn't say a word, just sat in the chair, hands on the leather, and breathed. Later, as Clara passed, he reached for her hand. "You're my land," he whispered, "the only thing I'd fight to keep." Smiled then, full and bright. That night, under a moon swollen with spring, they laughed. Really laughed for the first time, not because the past was gone, but because it had finally found its place behind them. A horse neighed in the distance. The wind picked up, but it was warm, and the porch light stayed on long after they'd gone inside. By midsummer, the ranch had settled into a kind of peace neither Clara nor Gideon had ever truly believed possible. The silence between them was no longer heavy with hesitation or grief. It was soft now, lived in, the kind of quiet that comes only when the worst has passed, and there is nothing left but to grow. The fields, once bare and brittle from winter's grip, now stretched wide with deep green. Wheat waved gently in the breeze, and new corn pushed stubbornly through dark soil. The fences had been rebuilt, not just repaired, stronger this time, with railings driven deep and posts sealed with care. Each board held the memory of effort shared between neighbors. Strangers who had once looked at Clara with suspicion, now greeting her with nods, warm bread and laughter. The house, too, had changed. The paint had faded in places, but there was pride in every plank. Clara had woven a wind chime from bones, feathers, and copper. She found by the river and hung it beside the porch door. Its sound was not loud, but when the breeze picked up, it filled the air with something old and sacred. Along the path to the barn, she had planted wildflowers, blues like the deepest part of the sky, gold like prairie fire, purples as soft as bruise petals. They grew tangled and free, not in neat rows, but in glorious disorder the way her memories of childhood had bloomed. Amos called them Mama's colors and picked bouquets every morning, leaving them in unexpected places, on her pillow, in Gideon's boot, by the water pail. Above the front gate, Gideon had carved a new sign from thick cedar. The letters were bold, sure, and clean. Ward Haven. Beside the name, he'd etched a 5-pointed star. It was the same shape he had once carved above the barn door in the dead of winter, back when Clara was still just a cook with guarded eyes, and he a man buried in silence. That star had been a mark of direction. Now it was a mark of arrival. That morning, Clara stood by the window, sunlight painting soft shapes across the wooden floor. In her hands she held a quilt, stitched not only with thread, but with time. It bore the symbols of her people, horses that ran with wind, suns that never set, rivers that remembered. Each square was a part of her journey. At its corner, she tied a small leather tag and placed it gently on Amos's bed. For our son. Later that afternoon, a wagon rolled up the road from Cold Water. The lawyer stepped out, this time not with questions or caution, but with a certificate in hand, legal, final, and true. The land was theirs. The marriage recognized. There would be no more riders, no more threats. Word spread fast, and by dusk, the porch was filled with neighbors. Someone passed a jug of cider. Children ran barefoot through the yard. Clara's cornbread vanished from the table in minutes, and someone asked for the recipe. As twilight fell, Clara stepped forward. She wore the same cotton dress she had stitched for their riverside wedding. The wind tugged gently at her braid as she faced the crowd. Without fanfare, she reached for her sleeve and pulled it back. The scar, dark and brutal, ran across her upper arm. It had once branded her less than human, a thing to be owned, past, broken. But now she bore it openly. "This scar," she said, voice steady, "is my story, and it brought me home." For a moment there was only the sound of wind through wheat. Then one clap, then another. Then the porch filled with applause. It was not pity, not curiosity. It was honor. Gideon walked to her, took her hand, and gently touched the scar with his thumb. "Her home," he whispered. That night, beneath a sky littered with stars, Clara and Gideon stood in the field, arms wrapped around one another. The air was warm with summer promise. The wildflowers swayed in rhythm, and the moon traced silver over the land they had fought for, not with bullets, but with bravery. "You tamed my heart," Gideon murmured. Clara leaned closer, her lips brushing his collarbone. No, she said, soft as a prayer. We found it together. Far beyond the trees, a wolf howled, low, long, and unafraid. It was not a warning. It was a song, and just above the gate, the wooden sign caught the moonlight. Ward Haven, built on love. Thank you for riding with us through the wind-swept plains and tender silences of the scar beneath her apron. Clara and Gideon's story reminds us that even in a land shaped by war, prejudice, and fire, love can still take root, not in spite of our scars, but because of them. If this tale stirred something in you, a tear, a sigh, a memory of what it means to belong, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. Here every week, we bring you unforgettable romances from the untamed frontier where bullets missed but hearts didn't. When you hit the bell, so you never miss a story carved from dust, danger, and devotion. Until next time, partner, ride safe and love wild.